G. A. Cohen's Journey at Oxford, From Moral Tutor to Philosophy. My journey began in Montreal, and in 1961, I moved to Oxford University, specifically to New College, to pursue a Bachelor of Philosophy. Upon my arrival, I was assigned a moral tutor, a role that existed back then for every student. This wasn't because I was considered immoral, rather, it was a standard practice. Nowadays, such positions have been replaced by college advisors, possibly because students are perceived as either exceptionally moral or so far gone that guidance seems futile. My moral tutor was Tony Quentin, who is still alive today but has since become Lord Quentin, the Baron Clinton. In Britain, it's fascinating how someone can transform from Tony Quentin to Lord Quentin overnight. Such dramatic shifts in identity weren't seen in Montreal. Although we had some earls in Montreal, like Earl Shapiro, Earl Bernstein, and even Earl McCormick, they were all women who retained their titles throughout their lives. This kind of identity metamorphosis, akin to magic or metaphysics, was unique to Oxford. At the time, Tony Quentin was simply Tony Quentin. A peculiar incident occurred during my time there, which I'll share with you. At a certain point in my story, I'll raise my arm to signal the transition from reality to a bit of imaginative storytelling, hoping it will elicit laughter. So, during my first term at Oxford, after about 10 days, I was utterly lost. I hadn't received any instructions on which classes to attend. One day, I happened to run into Tony Quentin in the quadrangle and asked him what I was supposed to do. He replied, "I should have thought you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle." This sentence, laden with auxiliary verbs, left me baffled. It seemed to imply that either I or he had done something wrong. To atone for whatever perceived misstep, I called Gilbert Ryle. After a few rings, I heard a voice say, "Royal?" A humorous mix-up that some of you might relate to from your own experiences. At the time, I assumed he was referring to himself as Ryle since my name wasn't Ryle but rather Cohen. However, that didn't entirely address the issue of what I was meant to say. I didn't quite feel that I should reply by saying Cohen, so I said, "Sir, my name is Jerry Cohen, and I was wondering if I could come and see you." He replied, "Yes, indeed." So I asked, "When should I come and see you?" He responded, "Pretty well anywhen." He did say that, "Pretty well my hand hasn't gone up yet," he said, "Pretty well anyone." "What about Thursday, crack of dawn?" "That's 10 o'clock. So, I showed up, and he was, in person, more forceful, booming, louder, but not intimidating. It's like when you go to the circus and see a clown shouting, you don't get intimidated. There was this marvelous way of talking, which was so mannered that people hypothesized it was a consequence of his experience as a major during the Second World War, where he had picked up this mode of speech. But I think it was so deep, he must have had it as a kid, even as a baby. I can't really imagine him whining as a baby, I can imagine him saying milk or burp. Anyway, we had a lot of arguments, and he was a marvelously generous teacher. On one occasion, he said, "And notice my arm hasn't gone up yet," we were talking about sensations, about pleasure and pain, and he said, "Unlike pain, pleasure lacks a distinct bodily location." So I said, "But sir, what about sexual pleasure?" He replied, "There is that, but I was thinking of something more interesting. There's a difference between agony and torture, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Do you have any thoughts about that?" So I said, "Let's see, I can agonize somebody, and I can torture somebody." I was kind of imitating his way of doing philosophy, where you say things that you can say and that you can't say, and that's it, right? I can agonize someone, and I can torture someone, and I can both be in agony, I can be in agony, but I can't be in torture. Then he said, and this is when he said, well, this isn't really what he said, but this is of the type of form or sort or kind of thing that he would say. He said, "Yes, torture and agony are the same kind of thing, but they're not the same type of thing because kinds and types, although the same sort of thing, don't belong to the same category. Since categories and classes, while alike in order, differ in nature because orders and natures, though similar in character, belong to different dimensions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we now come to a practical decision that we have to make together. I hope you don't find it boastful if I say what is true, I think I have pretty well enough material to I plan to continue in this relaxed and engaging manner for a total of 4 lectures, and I suspect that most of you would actually find this more enjoyable than the formal presentation I have scheduled. After all, a bit of enjoyment is a practical benefit in any learning experience. The challenge I'm facing is whether to stick with this light-hearted, informal style or to shift over to the more serious material I originally intended to cover. Although there is a strong case for maintaining this relaxed tone, doing so could have implications for my compensation. Each lecture is accompanied by a fee, and if I were to fill my presentations with continuous humor, I fear that my fee might have to be doubled. Moreover, knowing that Trent University is currently navigating some difficult times, even if one might say it's facing challenges of a certain kind, I am reluctant to add any further strain. With that in mind, I have decided to adopt a more serious tone now, even though transitioning from humor to formality can be a bit awkward. Let's start with the letter A on the handout. These lectures are actually the 4th installment in a critical discussion of John Rawls' theory of justice. The initial part of my critique was presented in the first of 3 articles cited in footnote 1 of the handout. The main thesis of these lectures, which were published as noted in the materials, is centered on a well-known principle associated with Rawls, the difference principle. To clarify, the difference principle claims that inequalities in society are acceptable only when they serve to improve the situation of the least advantaged members. In these lectures, I argued that while I did not oppose the difference principle directly, this principle fails to fully justify a key inequality that Rawls and other theorists assume it does. This inequality involves rewarding productive individuals with substantial monetary incentives. According to the Rawlsian perspective, if everyone were to receive an equal wage, those who have the capacity to work much harder and be more productive would lack the sufficient motivation to do so. By offering higher wages to these individuals, their increased productivity can be achieved, and ideally, the additional output could then be redistributed, through thoughtful government policies such as taxation, to benefit those who are less productive. This line of reasoning is quite familiar in current political debates. For instance, left-leaning politicians often advocate for raising taxes on the wealthy and using that revenue to support poorer citizens, while right-leaning politicians caution that such measures could dampen the incentives for hard work, ultimately lowering overall productivity and reducing tax revenues. In the Tanner lectures, I did not directly challenge the difference principle itself, that is, the idea that inequality is justified when it benefits the worst off, nor did I dispute the causal explanation that wage or salary differences can drive productivity. This does not mean that I was endorsing these views, rather, my aim was to offer a critique of the argument without completely rejecting either the principle or the underlying causal story. The core idea of my argument revolves around the causal narrative regarding the difference principle. My assertion is that, regardless of whether we accept the difference principle, it does not provide a valid justification for the inequalities present in a just society. This is due to a fundamental truth about the nature of a just society, which is that it consists of citizens who not only believe in but also actively uphold the principles that render the society just. One perspective on what constitutes a just society is that, above all else, it is a community where individuals act justly and treat one another fairly. I believe that the argument I am critiquing fails to meet this essential criterion for several reasons. To begin with, my critique of the aforementioned argument starts with the observation that the incentives leading to inequality are deemed necessary to support the interests of those who are less fortunate only because productive individuals are, in the absence of these incentives, reluctant to work as effectively as they would if such incentives were present. This argument presupposes a particular mindset among productive individuals and only holds true if these individuals exhibit and act upon that mindset. I contend that this reluctance to produce at previous levels when taxes increase, despite the fact that they would still be significantly better off than the least advantaged members of society, stems from purely self-interested motives. For instance, a highly skilled and well-compensated individual might choose to work fewer hours not because it would alleviate the burdens faced by those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, but simply because they prefer to enjoy more leisure time. This reluctance, as I have noted in my handout, indicates a lack of full commitment from productive individuals to the difference principle. If they genuinely believed that the only justification for inequality is that it benefits those who are worse off, they would not adopt the self-serving attitude that the argument attributes to them. The difference principle only legitimizes inequalities that are essential for improving the conditions of the disadvantaged. However, as I have pointed out, the inequalities created by incentive payments are not inherently necessary. They arise solely due to the unwillingness of productive individuals to engage in high levels of production without such incentives. Therefore, if the difference principle endorses these economic incentives, it does so only because productive individuals are not influenced by the difference principle in their economic actions. In other words, it suggests that these individuals are indifferent to the plight of those who are less fortunate when they leverage their significant bargaining power to maximize their market gains. Consequently, the difference principle only justifies unequal incentives if we view productive individuals as external to the community for which policies are being formulated, as if they were a natural force or outsiders whose behaviors and attitudes we must accommodate, rather than integral members of the society governed by the difference principle. Thus, although this narrative may not intend to do so, it effectively portrays productive individuals as an external entity whose actions are not guided by the principles that should govern the society. The concept of justice is often intertwined with the principles that govern a fair society. However, there exists a contradiction when individuals, who are expected to uphold these principles, engage in voting for tax policies that are meant to support the less fortunate. Once these policies are established, they may then seek to extract as much benefit as possible from the productive system, inadvertently worsening the situation for those they claim to help. This paradox raises questions about the integrity of their commitment to justice, especially when they align themselves with economic laws that I have discussed extensively in my lectures. I have also elaborated on this topic in 2 additional articles referenced in the handout, where I address various objections that have been raised. Some of these objections have already been published, and I have noted the works of critics such as Estelin, Poggi, and Williams in the footnotes. Their critiques, along with others that are forthcoming, highlight the complexity of the issue, which has evolved in ways I did not foresee when I initially critiqued the incentive argument. In my upcoming lectures, I aim to tackle a fundamental methodological disagreement regarding the nature of justice itself. This disagreement does not concern the specific content of justice but rather the overarching framework for determining what is just and what is not. I have come to realize that my methodological stance diverges significantly from that of Rylson's, and this divergence is crucial to understanding the substantive disagreements we have regarding incentives. To clarify this methodological disagreement, I will delve deeper into the substantive issues surrounding economic justice, which I now believe are partly rooted in our differing methodologies. There are 2 layers of disagreement at play. First, whether incentives that create inequality can be considered just, which is a substantive issue, and second, how we should ascertain the correct principles of justice, which I have yet to fully articulate but will address shortly. In my essay titled Where the Action Is, I tackled and believe I successfully countered an objection to my critique of Rawls's application of the difference principle, which I previously mentioned and refer to as the basic structure objection. According to this objection, my attempt to extend the authority of the difference principle from governing government policy to influencing the everyday choices of economic citizens is misguided. Critics argue that individual behaviors occur within the framework of society's basic structure and do not shape it, thus, principles of justice should only apply to this foundational structure. The Rawlsian perspective posits that justice pertains to the fundamental rules that govern economic interactions and social relations. Once these rules are established, individuals are free to act within that framework. To address the basic structure objection raised by Rawls and his theory of justice, let's examine why he identifies societal institutions as the primary focus of justice. Rawls argues that the fundamental rules governing society, its political constitution, property laws, and economic systems, deserve exclusive attention because they profoundly shape everyone's opportunities from birth. These state-enforced structures create an inescapable framework that influences life outcomes more significantly than individual actions. However, this reasoning appears incomplete. While institutional rules undeniably matter, the collective behavior of economic actors, like corporations, employers, and high-income earners, also dramatically impacts inequality. For instance, consider labor markets. When executives during the mid-20th century accepted salaries only moderately higher than their workers' wages, lower-income groups generally fared better. Contrast this with the post-1980s era under Reaganomics and Thatcherism, where amplified corporate bargaining power and a maximize profits at all costs mentality widened wealth gaps, even without major regulatory changes. This demonstrates how shifts in economic attitudes alone can deepen inequality, independent of formal rules. If we accept Ryle's own logic that justice concerns factors with profound effects on life chances, it becomes inconsistent to exclude individual economic behaviors from scrutiny. After all, a CEO's decision to demand a 500-to-1 salary ratio over workers' pay, or a corporation's choice to suppress wages despite record profits, directly harms disadvantaged groups. This critique suggests that a truly just society, as envisioned by the difference principle, requires two elements: 1. Fair institutional rules enforced by the state, e.g., anti-discrimination laws, progressive taxation. 2. A cultural ethos of justice guiding personal economic decisions beyond mere compliance. Without this ethical foundation, inequalities may persist even under fair rules. For example, lawyers or doctors might exploit market demand to charge exorbitant fees, not because regulations allow it, but because society normalizes self-interested greed. However, implementing this ethos raises practical challenges. Justice shouldn't demand unreasonable sacrifices, like expecting someone to take a stressful, socially vital job, e.g., waste management, without fair pay. The goal isn't to eliminate incentives entirely, but to balance them against collective welfare. In essence, Ryle's narrow focus on institutions leaves half the equation unaddressed. Justice isn't just about the rules we're forced to follow, but the choices we freely make within those rules. Imagine a scenario where a doctor would prefer to be a gardener instead of practicing medicine. In this case, both individuals, if we consider them as gardeners earning the same salary they currently receive, would likely find themselves in a more favorable position in terms of both financial gain and job satisfaction compared to many others in society. However, the reality is that we have a pressing need for doctors, not gardeners. To address this, we offer these two individuals a higher salary to entice them to become doctors rather than remain gardeners. Interestingly, one of them has a strong aversion to the medical profession, while the other genuinely enjoys it. Despite both preferring gardening over doctoring, their feelings towards the medical field differ significantly. The individual who dislikes being a doctor may feel justified in demanding a salary increase of, say, an additional $100,000 per year, as this compensation is essential for her well-being. Without it, she would likely feel quite unhappy. On the other hand, the second individual, who does not hate being a doctor but simply prefers gardening, is acting in a way that could be seen as contrary to egalitarian principles when she makes similar salary demands. It's important to note that we cannot delve into the inner thoughts and emotions of individuals to determine who might be taking advantage of the system or who is simply trying to secure fair compensation for their work. This complexity makes it challenging to assess whether someone is adhering to an egalitarian mindset. For instance, it can be difficult to ascertain if a particular job is so distasteful to someone that they would require significant compensation to perform it without feeling degraded. Often, even those closest to the individual may struggle to understand how repugnant a certain role might be for them. In fact, the individual may also find it hard to evaluate their own feelings about their job, as this requires comparing their job satisfaction with that of others, which presents significant challenges in understanding their own experiences. As I mentioned, the principles of an egalitarian ethos are not easily articulated, and determining whether someone is upholding these principles can be quite complex. However, it is crucial to highlight that it may be easier for both the individual and those around them to assess whether they are genuinely trying to align with an egalitarian ethos. The intricacies of this ethos, including the challenges in clearly defining it and the related difficulties in recognizing adherence to it, serve as a foundation for a critique from a young thinker named Andrew Williams. Williams argues that in the context of justice, particularly in a Rawlsian framework, there exists a principle of transparency regarding justice. This principle is vital for many, as it asserts that the rules of justice and an individual's compliance with them should be clear and understandable. The rationale behind this is that individuals should have the right to refuse any sacrifices that justice may demand if they do not have confidence that others are also adhering to these principles. It is important to recognize that self-sacrifice for the sake of justice should not fall solely on my shoulders unless I can be assured that others are also making similar sacrifices. However, how can I be certain that everyone is adhering to an egalitarian principle that is inherently vague? Even if we could define such principles clearly, the motivations behind people's actions are often hidden from view, making it impossible to determine who is truly conforming to these ideals and who is not. If we accept that the principles of justice must be public in nature, then my critique of roles becomes invalid. I argue that while we apply these principles to the state, we often neglect to apply them to individual behavior, which significantly influences the lives of others, particularly those who are less fortunate. I must acknowledge that modeling these principles for individual actions is not as straightforward as it is for state legislation. However, if justice requires a public dimension, then my attempt to extend the difference principle to everyday behavior will not hold up. If Williams is correct, my critique of roles collapses, and there is no contradiction in Rawls's omission of the difference principle from personal job and income decisions, as a public constraint on justice prevents such applications. I believe it is indeed beneficial for societal rules to embody this public characteristic, and while the ethos I support may lack this quality to some extent, I contend that publicity should be viewed as a design element of societal rules rather than a strict limitation on the essence of justice. In certain cases, such as the one we are discussing, treating publicity as a constraint on justice can clash with our fundamental intuitions about what justice truly means. These intuitions should guide us as we strive to define justice. For instance, during World War II in Britain, it was crucial for everyone to unite against the Nazi threat, and a prevailing principle of justice was that everyone needed to contribute their fair share. This principle was vital, and people would often discuss whether they had done their part or if others were contributing adequately. However, it would be unreasonable to expect a precise definition of what it means to do your bit in such a collective effort. It is unrealistic to determine with accuracy whether someone is making an appropriate contribution, as individual circumstances vary widely. For example, if one person is only able to volunteer 3 hours a week for air raid precautions while another can manage 6 hours, it might be due to personal challenges, such as caring for a sick child or dealing with a health issue like a bad back. For individuals, it can be quite burdensome to engage in collective efforts correctly. The reasons for varying levels of commitment among people can be influenced by numerous factors related to their circumstances. However, this variability does not negate the fundamental principle of fairness, which asserts that everyone should contribute their fair share. It is crucial to understand that the requirement for transparency in these efforts does not undermine the concept of justice. Nonetheless, it can impose limitations on the essential rules that govern society through coercive means. Take, for instance, the issue of racism. Many would argue that racism constitutes an injustice, regardless of how one defines justice. There are instances of subtle racism, where the perpetrator may not even be aware of their biases. For example, in hiring practices, an individual may unknowingly allow their judgment to be swayed by a candidate's skin color. Establishing universally fair treatment guidelines that are anti-racist is challenging, especially when they require a level of specificity that is often unattainable. However, this does not imply that racism is irrelevant to the discourse on justice. Earlier, I mentioned that the need for transparency in societal rules is at best a desirable quality, rather than a strict requirement for justice. In fact, I would argue that it is not always a desirable quality in the context of societal regulations. If we were to have a precise understanding of what equality entails, it could lead to oppressive outcomes. Consider a scenario involving a camping trip with friends. During this outing, they collaborate to gather and enjoy resources like fish and berries, operating under a mutual understanding that each person will contribute and benefit equally, even if this understanding is not explicitly defined. This situation highlights a significant point about camping trips, which has broader implications for political philosophy and the critique of both capitalism and socialism. It is generally accepted that egalitarian principles will guide interactions during such trips, with everyone striving to ensure that each participant has a similarly enjoyable experience. While it is possible for participants to express concerns about someone not pulling their weight, imagine the impact if the criteria for what constitutes doing your part were strictly defined. Such precision could actually diminish the quality of the group's interactions. The ambiguity of the rules in this context not only aligns with the notion of justice but is also beneficial. If these rules were to be clearly articulated, the natural and spontaneous egalitarian dynamics would likely devolve into a rigidly regulated environment. In summary, it is essential to differentiate between the societal rules that govern interactions and the publicly accessible rules that define justice. Although the need for transparency is often seen as a desirable aspect, it is important to recognize that it is not inherently linked to the essence of justice. This distinction is particularly relevant within the meta-theory of justice that philosopher Gilbert Ryle discusses. The meta-theory of justice does not define what justice is, rather, it provides a framework for understanding how to determine what justice entails. Let's discuss a concept known as constructivism, which I will explain shortly. The reason I bring up constructivism is that it provides a rationale for the publicity constraint, a notion I have begun to question. If the publicity constraint is indeed a valid principle, then my initial critique of Gilbert Ryle's application of the difference principle to justify social inequality would lose its strength. So, what exactly is constructivism? Many of you may already be familiar with this idea, but I want to focus on constructivism in the context of justice, which is the specific aspect I am addressing here. Constructivism posits that the principles of justice emerge from a particular selection process. In Ryle's framework, this selection process is referred to as the original position. In this scenario, individuals are unaware of their own social status, talents, abilities, or power. They are tasked with choosing principles that will govern society while operating under this veil of ignorance. This approach is intended to ensure that the principles selected are impartial, as no one can choose rules that favor their own interests when they do not know what those interests are. However, this constructivist method has faced numerous criticisms regarding whether the principles it generates are truly the best for governing society. Yet, my concern is not about the quality of the principles produced. Instead, I believe that the fundamental question being posed to these decision-makers is misguided. They are asked to determine which principles they would prefer for societal regulation, but this inquiry does not align with the more profound question of what justice truly is. The reason for this is quite straightforward: justice is not the only factor we should consider when establishing the foundational principles that govern society. We might also need to factor in the concept of publicity, even though it is not inherently linked to justice. To illustrate this further, the individuals selecting these principles must adhere to a meta-principle of stability, which Rawls highlights. When they are deciding on the fundamental rules that will govern society, they must consider the desire for these rules to be ones that people will accept and that will endure over time. It is pointless to establish a society based on certain rules if those rules are not going to be upheld shortly thereafter. However, the notion that justice is inherently stable is quite absurd. Justice can be a delicate achievement, and it is reasonable to speculate that maintaining justice in a consistent and reliable manner is challenging. As Plato noted, there is always a risk that things may deteriorate or go awry, and often, fortunate circumstances are necessary for justice to thrive. Constructivists cannot accept this perspective because the individuals making the choices must consider the stability of the principles they select. If they do not, they risk designing a system that will ultimately fail. Therefore, equating the optimal principles for societal regulation with justice is a fundamental error. The principles that are most effective for governing society must take into account various factors, including stability, rather than solely focusing on justice. My main critique of constructivism centers on its approach to justice, which, in my view, overlooks certain boundaries that justice itself does not acknowledge. To put it plainly, my single, overarching objection is this: constructivism equates justice with the broad set of rules used to govern society. This objection is summarized in the final sentence of the handout for today's lecture. In support of this main criticism, I have identified 4 specific sub-objections, 3 of which I will elaborate upon in upcoming lectures. Beginning with the first sub-objection, which I'll discuss in detail tomorrow, consider the factors related to human nature and the various ways that societies can be structured, both physically and sociologically. These factors undeniably influence our selection of guiding principles for organizing society. However, my argument is that, in reality, such empirical facts, indeed, any facts, are ultimately irrelevant to the concept of justice itself. Justice, I contend, is independent of these factual considerations. I realize this may sound unreasonable to many, but I hold firmly that the fundamental principles of justice do not depend on beliefs about human nature or societal structure. It is important to clarify that I am speaking specifically about the core, foundational principles of justice, as opposed to every single principle that falls under the umbrella of justice. Generally, when we discuss principles of justice, we tend to interpret and apply them in light of what we know about human behavior and the practical limitations inherent in social arrangements. Moreover, there are 2 additional factors, publicity and stability, that can lead to differences between the correct principles for governing society and those that are truly just. I briefly explained these earlier. In tomorrow's lecture, I plan to focus primarily on this philosophical perspective. For the majority of the session, I will set aside the topic of justice itself, only to return to it at the conclusion. My primary goal will be to convince you that our most basic principles, whether they pertain to justice, welfare, or freedom, are fundamentally unaffected by our beliefs about empirical facts. When I refer to principles, I mean the statements or rules we accept concerning what we ought to do or how we ought to behave. I'll state the main thesis of my upcoming lecture now for your consideration. Whenever someone uses a fact to justify a principle, which happens quite frequently, such as citing the fact that trust is undermined if promises are broken to support the principle that promises should be kept, or referencing the significant role of religion in people's lives to defend the principle of religious freedom, while I don't deny that facts can offer support for principles, I believe this support is always grounded in some deeper, more fundamental principle. In other words, facts only help determine which principles we adopt because there are more basic principles that do not themselves depend on facts. Or, to put it another way, when principles are shaped by facts, this is only because they also reflect underlying principles that are independent of factual circumstances. That concludes my remarks for today. Thank you all for your attention.